One year I was looking in the basement and I saw a chamber pot. And I thought, nobody will fight me for a chamber pot. Actually, it didn't even matter because I wouldn't even fight for a chamber pot myself. My name is Lisette Mallet. I come from the Acadian Peninsula in northeastern New Brunswick. I have my parents' chamber pot. In 1996, my mother broke her hip and had to go live in a long-term facility. And my father, with his younger sister, started emptying the house. So every year after that, my mother would ask me, "What do you want from the house?" With 5 other siblings, you can be pretty sure that whatever's in the house has been spoken for. And as the youngest, whatever I asked, somebody would want it. Not because they wanted it, but because I wanted it. Well, when my mother got over a surprise, she told me that was the first thing they bought for their new house. My father was born in 1922, and he was the second oldest. They were 14 children, although 2 of his younger sisters had died, as toddlers. And they were poor.
Home and abroad, an army was growing. For not only Britain had declared war, Canada.
My father was 17 when World War II broke out. And he was earning $1.75 a week. In the army, he could make $2.20 a day. So he decided to join the Navy. He made his way to Halifax, but they turned him back, told him he was too young. He was a bit upset because he had spent all his money going there, and that meant coming back with even less than he started with. 2 years later, at 19, he told my grandmother that he was enlisting in the army. She was really upset because she didn't want to have anybody go to war in the family, but she knew that the family would not survive without that kind of income. She gave him all the money she had, which was 60 cents. And him, being savvy with money, decided to walk all the way to Caraquet, which is 36 kilometers, in order to make the money last as long as possible. Halfway through, he had to throw his shoes away because they were all worn out, and he finished bare feet. And when he got to Caraquet, it was the end of the day, and they slept in the gym, and they caught the next train to Fredericton the next morning, and they arrived later that evening. So it was basically 2.5 days before he had his first meal. He never told his father or his older brother what he intended to do. I think the whole family still carried the stigma of my grandfather not enlisting voluntarily for World War I. Actually, when he was 22 years old and walking to the store, he was apprehended by the military police, and that was in July 1918, and basically thrown in jail and then sent to training camp. Fortunately, the war ended before he had a chance to go overseas. My grandfather was from a poor family as well. He was a fisherman, and he also had a business drying fish along the beach as a way to help with his meager earnings. They didn't have any land to grow fruits and vegetables. It was an interesting living. You could tell that there would probably have been tensions within the village, and the kids often acted up on it. My father, for example, when he was like 6 or 7 years old on his way to school, was suddenly grabbed by a gang of other kids from the other end of the village, and they put a noose around his neck and hung him up a tree. And he wouldn't be here if it wasn't for one of the elders in the village who was just walking by and saw him strung up in the tree, and he took him down. My father didn't want to explain, or maybe he didn't even know why they had done it. But he was often teased that his grandmother wore the feather. In the army, my father trained as an electrician and a mechanic. And he also offered to join the RCME and became a linesman to lay communication lines before battle. That earned him danger pay, an extra 50 cents a day. So his salary was $2.75. So when my father left for war, there were 14 people living in that house. When he came back, they were 16, plus my uncle's wife and their first child. And then my father got married in 46, and my mother came to live with them as well. Soon she got pregnant. There was no way, she said, that she was going to have that child in that crowded house. After all, it was a one-bedroom house with a curtain separating the grandparents from the rest of the family. So they moved into their first home in late spring 1947. And my brother was born in July 1947. Their only comfort was the chamber pot. I was born in the same house in 1960. It had electricity, plumbing, and running water. My grandparents' house now was mostly emptied of children. So it was finally the right size for them. Then in 1965, old age security was implemented in Canada. My grandparents thought about that as incredible wealth. The first thing my grandmother did was actually write a check to my dad for $200 to try to pay him back for all he contributed to the family during the war. And it was the first time also that she expressed to him that they would not have made it without him. In 1980, I came to Toronto to study. I met my man, bought a house in Roncesvalles, and had 2 kids. Life is rather comfortable. Les enfants ont aucune idée c'est quoi d'être pauvre. This is why I keep that chamber pot in our bathroom. I don't expect them to understand. After all, I only found it in my late 30s.
Oh, my mother was a very gregarious woman. She was head of the church group for 25 or 30 years, and those women loved her. My mother did not cut her hair, and I have a picture of her with her hair all the way down to her backside. She never really cut it. She wore it in a bun like women did in those days. And I don't believe she cut it for like a perm until she was maybe 60. And she was always sort of stout when I knew her, because when she was pregnant with me and her mother lived across the road, her mother didn't know she was pregnant until 3 weeks before I was born. My mother was born in 1885. So when she was 17, after going to normal school, she went as a teacher to Havelock and was in a one-room school with boys that were 16 because they'd been out on the farm and didn't pass their grades. So it was kind of interesting when they took her on buggy rides. Then she came back to Toronto and got a job teaching at Annette Street Public School. And she lived with her mother 291 Evelyn Avenue up near St. John's Road in the Junction. In 1904, my father moved from Richmond Hill. He was a widower and moved at 292 Evelyn, right across the road from where my mother lived, and he taught at Humberside. When they went to work, they both walked down Evelyn Avenue along Annette Street. She went into Annette Street School. He continued on to Humberside. So they had quite a relationship. Plus, both sang in the High Park United Church Choir. To make a long story short, romance blossomed. And when he was 40 and she was 24, they married. My grandmother was not too happy about that because she was only 50. She could have married him. In those days, and up until very recently in time span, once you were married, you no longer could teach. So my mother raised her family without working. My mother and father had 5 children. The eldest was a boy who, when he was 12, probably caught rheumatic fever. He died when I was 7 months old. So I think they didn't want to stay in that house. So she was pushing me in the pram, and she walked down High Park Avenue and saw this nice house for sale at the corner of High Park and Glen Lake. So she went back to my dad. So he went down to see it and said, "Oh, I'll take it." And he told me he never regretted it, even though it was more expensive than he should have taken on. But he never regretted it because it was a happy home. My father, as I say, taught at Humberside and had to retire when he got to be, I think they gave him an extra 2 years. He was 67 when he retired. Now, in those days, when you retired, you got half your salary. His salary tops was $3,600. So when he retired, he only got $1,800. Well, as time went on, he got ill with a heart condition and died at 75. The contract said that when the spouse died, the widows were cut off, no pension whatsoever. There had been a new contract instigated, but women in the old contract, they had no pension. Some of these women were so poor that they were living in garrets. And that teachers' organization, because they were in that old contract, would not give them a cent. They went to the ministry, they lobbied here, they lobbied there. Finally, after several years, and I could remember it, they finally gave them $25 a month. She didn't have enough money. She couldn't go to work when my father died. What would she do? So she had to take in roomers. And I was a teenager, and we were in a 4-bedroom house with a center hall plan, and I was in a bedroom here, and across the hall were roomers. And that's tough. And when we were married, we were the roomers. We went into 2 rooms up in her upstairs. So I was there for 4 years. And it's awful to have your mother across the hall. You can't have a good fight with your husband if your mother's across the hall. When she was going to be buried in High Park United Church, my father and my mother were stalwart supporters of that church. Anyway, we're going up the stairs to the funeral in the church, and I'm walking beside the funeral director. Now, my mother had died at 81, and we just had one evening of visitation with a closed casket. So all these women came to see this, and they laughed, because they remember all the fun they had had. So I'm walking up the stairs to the church, and the funeral director says, "Boy, you people certainly had a good time last night, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes," and she'd have loved it if she could have sat up and joined them. She was a nice woman, lots of fun, very generous with her house, and she would throw parties, and yeah, she was good, with a big laugh too.
My name is Joy Comstead, and I'm going to speak briefly about my grandfather, William George Rowe. In the last 30 years of his working life, he was responsible for the erection of steel frameworks for buildings and hanging of bells in churches. One of the more significant buildings that he was responsible for was the construction of Sick Kids Hospital. My grandfather, it is said in our family, was responsible for the decision to move from riveting to welding the framework for this hospital. And the rationale that my grandfather shared with the family was that he was worried about the noise that riveting would cause if he had used this technique among the other hospitals, and he didn't want to disturb the patients. My grandfather was raised in Trinity, Newfoundland. His early life was as a fisher, working on schooners and as a lighthouse keeper. But when the economy in Newfoundland became so poor, my grandfather, who was born in 1881, left the colony for Canada and arrived in Ontario with his young family. He was popular among Newfoundlanders, and those who had followed him coming to Toronto for work would contact him, and my grandmother would talk about receiving phone calls about, "Where's Skipper? I'm here and I need work." And my grandfather was known for not turning away anyone that he could employ. He knew that the skills that Newfoundlanders had would make excellent high-rise workers. The one memory that I have, and he died when I was very young, was his playing with me and playing with his glass eye that he'd lost from riveting.
My grandparents came to Toronto from England primarily to look for work for my grandfather. And they lived in the west end of the city, and they first lived on Batavia Avenue, 23 Batavia Avenue. At that time, Jane Street was the end of the city, and it was as far out as you could get, and they were there because it was the most affordable place to live in the city. My grandfather worked for Otto Hegel, who made the actions for Heinzmann pianos. There was a big Heinzmann piano factory in the Junction, but he worked at 680 King Street West, which is at the corner of Bathurst and King, and he used to walk from basically Jane and St. Clair to Bathurst and King in order to save the 5-cent streetcar. My grandparents did not have a lot of money. My grandmother was ill Most of the time she had a series of heart ailments. She was looked after by the doctor for the Toronto Maple Leafs, so they became great Maple Leafs fans, and at times they even had some of the Maple Leafs boarding with them. But the area that they lived in was quite poor, and during the Depression, the railway was very close to them, and the fellows riding the rails used to often come to the back door looking for handouts of food, or often they would try to exchange work in order to have some food, and Granny always gave them something regardless of the fact that she didn't have very much. But one day a fellow came to the door, and she just had nothing. She just couldn't spare anything, and she turned him down. And a couple of days later, she found a description in the paper, and she could tell from the description that it was the same young man, and he had jumped in front of a train and committed suicide. And Granny never turned anybody away again. It affected her whole life.
I came home from public school. We seemed to have music in the morning because when I'd come home for lunch, my mother would say, what did we learn or what did we sing in the morning? And she could accompany me. She could just pick up the chords to accompany me. I can remember doing that time and time again. We had a piano room. My mother's father was a Baptist minister, so she grew up with music. But her father died. He was a preacher, and he used to go all around. He died in Chicago, actually. Really, they had hard times because her mother was left with 5 children and a yet unborn son. But they always had music. So my mother learned to play the piano. I have a picture of the house and the living room where she grew up, and it has a piano in it. So she played the piano. She had a degree in English from the U of T. She had graduated from Western Hospital in nursing, and I think I understand she was the top graduate. So she was given a scholarship to the first program of public health nursing at U of T. So she graduated from there. And all those years, she was a church organist and choir master at High Park Baptist Church. But once she married my father, she gave up all her nursing. She had been a public health nurse at Runnymede and Annette Street Public School and drove her own car. And that she was married in 1925, so it was all prior to that. And she never worked since then except at home. And a cousin of mine who is 10 or 12 years older than I remembers so much more. And she was always sort of resentful. She knew her Aunt Min, my mother, as a very active, professional person. She was lively and very talented, I think. And once she married, she never drove the car again. But then they were married in 1925, and it was only 4 years, and she'd had these 3. Well, my brother was born in 1930, so she was busy with children and the household. And then the Depression came, and that changed a lot of things too.
I'm Mavis Wilson. Nicholas Jennings writes about the Canadian music scene, and in his book, Before the Gold Rush, he talks about the summer of '69. My friend Peter and I missed out on Woodstock. In the summer of '69, we were simply too young to make the trek, but we did get to go to an all-Canadian version of that historic festival. Held in a campground near Orangeville, Ontario, over the Labor Day weekend, the Freakout at Rock Hill Park featured no fewer than 21 of Canada's best bands on 3 stages, including one on a small lake. We soaked up some great music that weekend by the likes of the Guess Who, Lighthouse, the Five-Man Electrical Band, and Motherlode.
When I die, I hope I'll be.
To us, those bands were homegrown heroes, local acts that had gone on to become stars. And who brought those stars to Rock Hill Park? My dad, J. Elwood Hill, Mr. Rock Hill. He was larger than life. He was a big man with big hands and a big special laugh that you would recognize anywhere. His 5 daughters were embarrassed by that laugh. Elwood's father lost everything in the crash of '29. And following the Great Depression and the death of his dad, Elwood inherited the farm with a mortgage and a 15-year-old car with a bank loan, 5 of 7 cows with tuberculosis. Much of the farm wasn't great for farming. Limestones, big and small, were all over the land. But Elwood knew some other things about that land. The rock formations of the Niagara Escarpment broke through on the property. There were caves and crevices to explore, and from the top of the cliff, there was a magnificent view of 6 townships. The springs that fed the Boyne River were also on the property. In 1955, the bank loaned Elwood the money to follow his dream. He wanted to create a cottage development around 2 spring-fed lakes, and he called this development Springwater Lakes. Then with the cottagers enjoying their private resort, people still kept coming, wanting to have picnics around the lake. And this gave Elwood an idea. He turned to the eastern portion of his property and developed a campground and a picnic ground with its own swimming pool, a man-made swimming pool. And this he called Rock Hill Park. My mom, Jean Hill, was an enthusiastic and hardworking partner in each of their endeavors. And my sisters and I, we spent our childhoods picking up garbage, cooking French fries, and cleaning washrooms. We were a musical family, and Dad thought the campers and the local folks might enjoy music too. He started Saturday night dances and Sunday night talent shows. And on each of those shows, Dad wore this hat and performed. I particularly remember Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain and Your Cheating Heart.
Your cheating heart will make you weep.
At first, the talent shows had local performers and local audiences. But soon, the contestants were coming from further afield, as were the crowds, which were getting bigger. Elwood had an ear for music and a heart for homegrown talent. Juno and Country Music Award winner Carol Baker performed on one of the earlier talent shows when she was just 13. She didn't win, but Elwood encouraged her and told her there was a future for her in the music business. Joe Firth and the Promised Land, Johnny Burke, Gordon Audie Henry worked on their careers on the stage at Rock Hill Park. And Stompin' Tom Connors credited Elwood with giving him his first big musical break.
Hello out there, we're on the air, it's hockey night tonight.
As the park's popularity grew, so did Elwood's vision. His idea to bring in the big country acts from Nashville was a big gamble. But the stage on the water, known as the Showboat, featured the biggest acts over the years: Kitty Wells, Freddie Fender, Ronnie Prophet, the Oak Ridge Boys, Conway Twitty, Tom T. Hall, Johnny Rodriguez, Grandpa Jones, Ferlin Husky, Tex Ritter, Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper, they were the first ones, Stonewall Jackson, Dottie West, Wilf Carter, Webb Pierce, all performed there. But with the crowds growing from 2,000 to 15,000, the stage area had to be moved to another area of the property. And there performed Charlie Pride, Barbara Mandrell, and Willie Nelson.
Through the ages,
And along the way, Rock Hill Park began being referred to as the Nashville of the North.
Blue eyes crying in the rain.
Before and leading up to Woodstock and before the Rock Hill Park freakout, there was a lot of bad publicity about hippies and drugs. Hippies would tramp your grain fields.
The big thing at the Strawberry Fields was the rock sounds, and they were there this weekend with many big names.
They would give drugs to your teenagers.
Drugs, openly sold like hot dogs at a country fair.
They would engage in nudity.
With temperatures in the 80s, clothes were quickly shut.
There were obstacles along the way. There was fallout from the freakout. Despite the boost to the local rural economy, food, gas, motel rooms, local jobs that Dad provided for people, Mulmer Township Council, in a mean-spirited move, made Elwood pay for the salting of the gravel road from the highway to the park. And there was a great deal of nastiness locally. It was discussed and debated in the provincial legislature. Dad would spend 3 days in a Toronto courtroom fighting an injunction to stop his festivals. He was determined not to be put out of business. In the end, there were some time constraints, but he went ahead and had 2 other festivals scaled down in the summers of 1970 and 71. And the big country shows continued on into the 80s. Waylon Jennings was booked for a big show, but he wasn't allowed to cross the border. He was facing drug charges in the US. Dad had an audience there and no headliner. Then he received a phone call from Tommy Hunter. "Elwood, do you need help?"
Well, his right foot stomped the pedals.
And he came and put on the show. The audience was offered their money back, but very few actually came and asked for it. These were all outdoor concerts, and rain was the worst thing that could happen. One summer, it seemed to rain every weekend, and I remember as a child thinking, God doesn't love our family anymore. When megastar Willie Nelson was coming, the crowd was expected to beat all records. 40,000 were planned for. But it rained all weekend long. It really dampened spirits and profits. And as one newspaper printed, the crowd got drenched, but the promoters took the soaking. Stompin' Tom Connors, in his autobiography, Before the Fame, writes about Rock Hill Park. He was at the Shelburne Fiddle Contest, performing in the park. He ran into a guy by the name of J. Elwood Hill. He was running the big stage shows at Rock Hill Park, Ontario, and was due to bring in Hank Snow to play in the very near future. Tonight he was just roaming around listening to some of the stray talent, and when he heard me sing and play, he asked me if I'd like to appear on the Hank Snow show. Tom didn't believe him. He thought it was just some guy out trying to make an impression. But a couple of days later, this Hill guy called and asked Tom to be at Rock Hill Park on the afternoon of the 19th of August, and what professional name, if any, did I go by when I was performing? He wanted to include it in the newspaper ads. But when he hung up, Tom still didn't quite believe it. A few days later, I had to eat my words. An envelope came in the mail with a newspaper clipping in it. Between Reg saying, "I told you, Tom," and Muriel saying, "Oh my God, that's wonderful," I had a hard time reading the ad. In big bold letters it said, "Hank Snow and the Rainbow Ranch Boys, appearing August 19th at Rock Hill Park." In smaller letters just below the words "also appearing" were a number of other names, and at the very bottom of the list, I almost choked up when I read the words, "and special guest star, Stompin' Tom Connors."
And we're out to have a fun before it's Saturday night. Yeah, the girls have the bingo and the boys
Today, the Niagara Escarpment Commission has helped the Bruce Trail with owning the 26 acres of the property where the caves and crevices come through. Elwood would be so happy that people who appreciate that, as he did, are able to be there. And I wonder, do they hear the ghost of Stompin' Tom singing the hockey song? Or do they hear Elwood's special laugh? Every time I think of him, I remember that laugh, and I wish that I could hear it again, for real.
Well, my dad was a fireman at the fire hall over on Runnymede Road, and they used to work long shifts, like weekends. And I can't really recall how frequently it was, but it was quite regular. And it was I don't know if it was a chore or my duty or just that I liked doing it. But I used to take Sunday dinner over to him. Now, they did have facilities there that they could cook, but some weren't as good cooks as others. And so I guess on these days, I would take dinner over to him, like a container. And I had a little dog named Spanky, and I used to take her with me. And I mean, it was so repetitious. Every time I would take it, we'd go through the same thing. The firemen were always there, and they were always teasing me that they would buy my dog for me for a nickel or something, and I was aghast. I mean, this is my dog, you're offering me, no, there's no way I'm giving up that dog. You know, but that was just a little story, one of my memories, and of course my dad enjoyed the dinners. My dad, he was quite young when he had a massive heart attack, and so he couldn't be on the force then. He was on for about a year, you know, and then finally he couldn't do it. And so when he retired, just for something as a hobby, he started raising dogs, and we had these litters of pups, and it was kind of supposed to be a business, but he sure didn't make any money on it. And every time we tried to give up one of the dogs, we'd cry because we wanted to keep them all, you know. Yeah. So it wasn't a lucrative business, I wouldn't say, but it was fun for us.
I saw my grandmother perform, and it's my grandmother I went to perform, and this is funny. There used to be an Eaton Tavern. It's on Danforth. It's called the Eaton, and I don't know I can't remember my age, but all I remember is the girl came in with a tray with beer glasses, and my Uncle Bobby was playing in a band. I can't remember the name, and my grandmother got up and sang. Right, so I was just like, wow. And of course, at home there was a piano. She'd sing all the time. But that's the only place I ever saw her was at the Eaton. I know I was way underage because they snuck me in the back and I sat me in a chair, and I must have been maybe 8 or 9 because they gave me a coloring book and told me just to sit there. And then my grandmother came over and brought me a draft, and she said, "This is what, you know," and I was like, "Oh, okay." So that was like, great. That was my introduction to draft beer. And I was like, this stuff smells like skunk, right? And she's like, you know, whatever. And she got up and she sang. And she sang her song, "What You Want, Baby," R-E-S-P-E-C-T. And the place was, I remember, I'm like, wow, they're all like, you know, it's my grandmother. And she's like giving me beer and singing. This is good, right?
My name is Lois Broad. I lived right behind the Runnymede Library. When we moved there, it was before the subway went through. I live in the corner of Glendonwood and Margin is 1 block up from Bloor. When the subway went through, they took a couple of houses on Glendonwood behind the library, and then the south side of Margin all the way along, they took down the houses and left a great big field of sand. And I have 5 sons. So the kids, my kids, and all the kids in the neighborhood had this huge, lovely, vacant lot to play in. They could dig the sand, they could play baseball, they could play football, they could play golf, they could do anything they wanted. Well, and when they were there, we knew exactly who they were with, and the mothers in the streets around would phone me and say, for instance, Lois, tell Michael to come home for dinner. So I would I lived in the upstairs, and I would open my window and yell, Michael, go home for dinner. That every mother did that. So that's why I have a voice that throws. Anyway, they had a wonderful time. Then Mr. Boychuk was the alderman at those days, and he thought he would get lots of votes if he made that a nice green park. So he got it through council, and they built a lovely park with a sign that said, no ball playing, no golf, no nothing, right? He lost the election.
My name is Ruth Chandler, and I am 89 years of age. I've lived in Warren Park 65 years. I was the treasurer of the Warren Park Sports Association. I registered all the kids for baseball and for hockey in my house. Gord Jukes was the one that started the Sports Association. My husband always said that I registered 600 kids. And I had a girls' baseball team. I couldn't tell you how many teams there were. Well, it took me one whole Saturday to do it. It cost them $3 to join. And there were some families that couldn't afford it. So I registered them anyways. I knew the families, so I knew that money was very hard on them. So I thought, well, what the heck? There was no lamps in arena. There was a nice thing that the kids could skate on. And as parents, we would go up on a Saturday morning and we would clean all the ice so that the kids could play hockey. And there was kind of a small building that we could stand in. The kids enjoyed it. They didn't care that it was cold outside. And that's where they started the hockey, was up there. And of course the baseball was at the river. They used to flood a lot of places, the township did. They flooded up at Lambton until Florence Gall got in. And she got them to build an arena there. Oh, the parades were wonderful. They were held for the opening of ball. They would start right outside here. And they would go down varsity. And there would be girls throwing batons, and we got dressed up in old-fashioned clothes. We also had a sports night where, we gave out trophies and stuff. We had a lot of celebrities come to that. Bobby Beaufort, my husband was able to get him because he was a distant cousin. The first one we had was in Warren Park School, and George Chavallo was there. Rocket Richard, he was there. Dickie Duff was there. One year they had the radio station had a ball team, and they come down and played all the coaches. They had a great time. A lot of it was kibitzing, you know, but it was really good. I just loved it.
My name is Lois Broad. I'm the old Broad. I grew up on High Park Avenue at the corner of Glen Lake. I was right on the corner on 107 High Park. Robert McMichael, you know, McMichael Gallery up Islington, he lives up just below Humberside, which is the first block up from Glen Lake. And I think I was in grade 9 and he was in grade 13, so I didn't really know him, but I knew of him because he and his brother were the first kids that bought an old car and drove up and down High Park Avenue in the old car, you know, kids did. The next time I heard of him, he had rented an empty store up in the junction on Dundas, and he hired the immigrant women that lived in that area, and he packaged, you know how you have a package of crackers for your soup, 2 crackers? He started that up in the junction, have these women package that. Now, he quit that because I guess he wanted other things, but eventually he made all his money in packaging. Also, he went into wedding photography. Now, I was married in 1949, and Robert McMichael took my wedding pictures. And when I go up to McMichael Gallery, I tell the staff, and they're very pleased because they've never heard of anybody that he took their wedding pictures.
We used to live just north on Minicote in what was originally a cottage. A lot of the little tiny houses here were cottages originally. And we bought it, I bought it for $49,000. It was advertised in the paper, and I said to my husband, "Oh, I want to go look at this house." He says, "Well, I've got a meeting, so you just go, and if you like it, you buy it." So I went, and I bought it. And he says, "Tell me about it." I says, "Well, it has this great playhouse at the back of the yard with a kitchen in it. Can you believe a children's kitchen in the playhouse? And it has a tire swing, and it has the longest clothesline you've ever seen." He says, "Does it have a basement?" Oh, I don't know. It's really quite shocking. That was halfway up Minicote, but you couldn't see it now. When we sold it, they put it in a box the next day, in a dumpster the next day, and they built one of those huge homes. So that house was $49,000 when we bought it, and I think $64,000 when we sold it.
In 1970, I got a job at Sunnyside next to the pool at a concession stand. A family friend got me the job for the summer. I actually met my future husband there. He was my boss. My mom always said that was the only time he was ever my boss. It was a company called Canterbury Foods that ran the concession stand, as well as they had Varsity Stadium, they had a spot there. And also down at the exhibition, the actual X, and then they had the winter fair, and they had the home show. So you got to work quite a bit. I ended up working at the winter fair, and I was sent up to the mezzanine. Why they even had a concession stand there, because you had to climb up to the top of the building. My supervisor's name was Isabel, and she said, had I ever made popcorn before? And I said, no, but I mean, how hard could it be? So she showed me how to make it, and that was fine. She said, okay, you're on your own. The next time we have to make popcorn, you do it. So I did what I was supposed to. I put the oil in, I put the popcorn in, except I forgot to close the door. Once the popcorn started popping, it was pelting, seriously. Customers, people were ducking, and there was popcorn everywhere. Isabel she didn't say anything. And she just started sweeping it up. So that was the end of that. I don't think I worked with her again. I don't know if that was because she didn't want to work with me or whatever. Terry and I started going out in January, and in, I guess, around February, he wanted to have me come over for dinner to meet his family. I go in the kitchen, and there's Isabel. I couldn't believe my eyes. I did tell Terry later about the story, and she never said a word. She was a kind woman, and I just knew I'd love her forever, and I did.
My first job after university, I got a job at Simpson's downtown. During that interview, they were allowed to ask whether I was married, whether I was going to get married, whether I intended to have children. But anyway, I got the job, and I'm sure I answered honestly, like I didn't really know. And then I worked in a department called Methods Research, which I don't really know what methods research is even to this day. I worked there for 2 years. One of my jobs was someone had complained about the coffee trolley, which they would push to certain different floors, and people could have coffee, not for customers, but for staff. And the trolley was too difficult to move on and off the elevator. So I had a 4-year degree in honors sociology, and I'm supposed to figure out why this trolley won't go on and off the elevator, about what the wheels are. So I suggested they get new wheels. Like, how hard was that? But no, that wasn't what they were going to do. I don't know whether that was just a test case. Then my next commitment was I was to go into the men's department, and I don't know how much people know about the men's department at Simpson's at that time. It was very exclusive. And also the salespeople were elderly men who really knew about male fashion at that time. So I was supposed to go in, this young chick just straight out of university, and tell them that their price tags were not appropriate. So I went in and I told them their price tags are not appropriate, and maybe they should think about updating them. And that's all I remember about that part of that job. And then my other job, those of you that know that Simpsons store will know that the street that runs north-south from Queen, I guess it is, it slopes. So the north end of the Simpsons store, there's only one step, but at the bottom, because it goes downhill, there's 6 steps. And somebody had been told that that was dangerous and that people were falling there all the time, and there was going to be a liability suit. So my job was to sit in the restaurant across the road for a week, remembering my 4-year honors sociology degree, and count the number of people that tripped on those stairs. I drank a lot of coffee. Not a one person tripped on those stairs.
My name is Verna Van Sickle. I opened my record store roughly around 1956, 57. I opened it at Cumberland and Yonge, which was very near Yorkville. And it was a key area for the time. And it was right at the corner, and it was very nice. Initially, I wasn't sure, but I had a different point of view with regard to stock of records. I wanted to get in depth. That means not just the fast sellers and the top hits. I had a variety of things and something for everybody, including records for children. There was so much rich material in those days. Siobhan McKenna reading fairy tales, Daddy Kay with all kinds of crazy stuff with music. And it was a beautiful era, and people wanted to hear music, and they came in and weekends and bought 3 records and 4 records and went home and spent the weekend listening to music. But there were a lot of writers from the States, women who were writing about, a better relationship between and society. And many artists came in the store. Tugs were hanging out for a cup of coffee. And people like Gordon Lightfoot came in, Neil Young, and who else? Donald Sutherland used to hang out there because they come in and talk. We always had interesting discussions. Joni Mitchell came in. Yeah, she lived in the area, actually, not too far over. That started in the middle of 66, because it was so much fun to live in that area, I don't know that they meant to do that, but that's what happened. I left the store because of the change in the whole industry. It became incredibly competitive, in the sense that we were back ordered a lot by the companies, the smaller stores, and the big companies got all the stock that came in. Back order meant that you didn't have a lot of records that you should have had. And then the discount came in, and that made it very difficult to make ends meet and buy stock and keep a standard going and pay your bills.
My name is Elizabeth Goldner Ross. In 1968, I was known as Liz Goldner, the first woman to sell print advertising space in New York City.
Don't you love her, man?
1968 was a dangerous time in New York City. But I was young and fearless. I had this rent-controlled apartment at 62nd and Lexington, right down the street from Bloomingdale's. It was a no security walk-up. I had a bedroom on the fire escape where a drunk fell in the window, so I got bars on the window, and then I couldn't get out in case of fire. But I didn't care. I felt like I was at the center of the universe at that time. Nationally, the news was terrible too. Our beloved leaders were being killed every day. Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Vietnamese War, the protests, and yet this great music coming at us daily. We didn't know what to listen to first or what it all meant. It was my dream of being a Broadway dancer that brought me to New York. But very few cattle calls taught me that I didn't have enough technique and I had no connections.
I had saved enough money to go to Europe, which was another dream, and there I happened to dance the can-can with the Moulin Rouge. But that's a whole other story. I came back to Manhattan in 1967, but I didn't want to be a dancer anymore. I came back because I loved New York. So I took a boring job just to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. I was feeling pressure from the growing competition of all us baby boomers who were just on the cusp. All markets were getting crowded, and I had no college degree. As it happened, down the hall from my boring job was the rock magazine Hullabaloo. Just incredible traffic back and forth all the time, counterculture types in their leather jackets and jeans and cowboy boots, blasts of music. I started stopping in there, chatting up the manager, Joe Coleman. Joe knew that Steve Kahn's Flip magazine, another teen magazine, was profitable on circulation alone. 200,000 copies a month made it America's fastest growing teen magazine. Steve Kahn was a lawyer, fresh out of law school when he started Flip, and was written up in the New York Times. When I came on board in 1967, we were only 3 people in the office. Steve chased down most of the stories himself. And he took me up to the Waldorf once with him to meet the Bee Gees. And we walked in the middle of Andy having a tantrum, and Brother Morris ran down to the lobby to buy him a big, big teddy bear. And I always wondered who bought those overpriced items in hotel lobbies. Bands came to our office occasionally. Grace Slick and the Union Gap, I got to take their photographs and have them published in the magazine. And I had a friend, Kenny Goodman, who was a publicist for the Pink Floyd at the time. I didn't know who they were, but he invited me on a photo shoot to Central Park, and I had a picture of myself up in the tree with the Pink Floyd in my beautiful leather jacket that I had just bought with the first money I'd made at Flip, and a cowboy hat. Unfortunately, I lost that shot with all my souvenirs when I left New York, not long after I worked at Flip. I loved being exactly where I was in 1968. Going to rock promotions, dark places, flashing lights, strobe lights, enough weed in the air for a contact high, dining on hors d'oeuvres, access to any music event I wanted, free tickets to Hair, Janis Joplin on her last tour at Fillmore East, Studio 54, Village Vanguard, endless stimulation. But in 1968, Madison Avenue was a men's club. We know that now from Mad Men. But I was young and fearless. I thought I was part of the times that were changing. The men I was selling to didn't know what to make of me. I was 24 and I looked 18. I was cute, articulate, and persistent. They let me take them out for 3 martini lunches and then bought cheap ads. 6 months of small ads made Steve impatient. So he bought a back page of the New York Times for a life-size photo of me. Meet Flip's new ad manager. Well, all kinds of high-powered executives were only too happy to take my calls and give me appointments. And a whole new world opened up to me. Steve's second idea was to run a promotion for McGraw-Hill to launch their new Beatles biography by Hunter Davies in exchange for running a full-page ad. I had to press Steve for one, but I got it. In lieu of a raise, I got a Beatles book. I left Flip in 1969, and my autographed copy of the Beatles biography is my one remaining souvenir. So, why did I leave? It was such an exciting time to be in New York. But there was a dark side. We were still living in a madman environment. Women were underpaid. Raises I was promised never materialized, and the birth control pill that launched the sexual revolution left us without an excuse to say no. Selling advertising space in Flip magazine cost me my health. Flip was a tough sell. The low-level ad men that I initially dealt with called it a pulp rag full of undressed hairy rockers. To cajole them into buying even small, cheap black and white ads in the back of the magazine, I suffered through 3 martini lunches that made me sick. I had chronic indigestion at the time, lost 20 pounds I didn't need to lose. Then, having my life-size face on a New York Times ad upped the ante. Suddenly, high-powered ad men took my calls, and I walked right into a date rape. Shortly after that, I got pregnant, nearly died of peritonitis following an abortion. I may have been fearless at the start, but after a year and a half, I was burnt out. I left New York, traveled in Europe, settled down with a new husband in rural Sweden, but that is another story.
I have been very blessed to have a number of words that my mother taught me at her knees. The most important being, "But for the grace of God, go I." My name is Lynn Seward. I'm 64 years old and just beginning to explore my creativity. And I started out with a camera, a cheap camera, and I've always been lured to street life. I've never been able to walk past homeless people and not feel a tug. So I began meeting face-to-face with homeless people in downtown Toronto with my camera and with my heart. I just was so filled with compassion and a deep desire to really make these invisible people, my brothers and my sisters, visible to my brothers and sisters. This man's name is Bear. He's an Indigenous man. I found him sitting on the stairs of Holy Trinity Church, and I just sauntered up beside him and sat down and said, "Hey, do you feel like talking?" And he just dove right into the center of his story. Bear grew up in a very abusive home with parents who were victims of residential school. His father abused and abused and abused every member of the family, but most especially Bear's mother. And before we parted, he said, "Can I give you a hug?" And he wasn't the first or the only person to have asked for a hug. And I fully embraced him and felt like, I don't know, I can't describe how it felt to get to know someone this way and to make him come alive to other people. How do you sleep comfortably on the streets? I took photos of people who look like angels sleeping on the streets. I took photos of people who look like they had been crucified sleeping on the streets. And yet they slept on the streets, and many of the people I spoke to who were not asleep said it was safer to sleep on the street than in any given shelter, and it's safer to sleep during the day. So that's why I saw so many. But the innocence and then the stark contrast of just raw humanity tore at my soul, and continues to. I call Rowena my street princess. She's a young girl addicted to crack and opiates. She has an older man who pimps her out, and all she gets in return is her drugs. She doesn't get a home, she doesn't get a room, she gets nothing. I asked her one day, why do I meet up with her frequently? She seems to be wherever I go, and she is so precious to me. And I said, Rowena, you're always in a beautiful dress. Why do you wear dresses? She said, it's easier to turn a trick. And all of our encounters end with the warmest embraces I've ever experienced. On my many excursions on the pavements of downtown Toronto, I always felt there was a witness beside me, a witness who was watching and also protecting and informing me of my next step. I did not know who that witness was until I had a conversation with my brother on my dad's back death, and we were reminiscing about our mother's influence on us. And I burst into tears and said, Mom was walking with me. Mom was there holding my hand when I was scared. My mom was there. As were her many teachings that both my brother and I learned at her knees. I met Chris, who is a young homeless man. I see him sitting quietly on the streets outside of Osgoode Hall, and we've developed a friendship. I stopped by, he asked me after the first time we met if I would come and visit him once in a while because he had no friends. And I said, I would be delighted to be your friend and honored. So I go back often. Sometimes he has a lot to tell me. Sometimes he says, Lynn, I'm just too depressed to even breathe. I spend a lot of time at Diversity Gardens behind City Hall. It's my go-to place because I live in the heart of downtown. And I always see this silent man sitting in a chair, just like he was some sort of Buddha or just an all-knowing man. And it took me many trips there to go over and speak to him because I didn't know what he was all about. And I went over and I just said, you look so very comfortable. And he said, I am. As I walked along Yonge Street one afternoon, I came upon two very different men. An older man with a beard, very gray, wearing a patch over one eye, in a wheelchair, with a young man, eyes so piercing that I could not look away. I asked, why are you together? And they said, we take care of each other. The young man pushes the older man through the streets of Toronto in a wheelchair as they escape from a horrible boarding house that they live in by night. The young man, his voice is the older man because he's autistic and has no words. The two are married together on their journey. I came across lots of different signs, like, is life still worth living? No empathy equals ignorance. A huge eyeball painted on a mailbox that made me think of eyes wide open as you walk the streets. How am I to get to heaven? So these signs informed my walk, the good life. So present in downtown Toronto. Huge billboards with beautiful people walking down the street, laden with shopping bags from designer stores, so beautifully turned out as they walk through their life, never even glancing at those on the sidewalk. That green bag costs $5,000. It could support a homeless person, pick somebody up from the depths and rise them up to a place where they could re-enter society. But I wonder if any of these people with money to buy fancy clothes and live in fancy condos, do they even give a care about those that they ignore? So many homes scattered along the sidewalks, sleeping bags, cardboard, plastic, suitcases, untended to. No one's living there at the moment. But I talked to others around these homes, and they said to me they were keeping 6 on the other person's belongings. And keeping 6 means you're taking care of and watching out for the other person's belongings. And sometimes I really want to bring someone to my home so that they can bask in the beauty and the warmth. But I do not dare. I did before at one time. I have spoken with many bearded men along the way. I think they are hiding the ravages of their face, the lines, the scars maybe. Some responses were very similar, such as, I made my own mistakes, and that's why I'm here. Nobody put me here, I did. Very emphatic about that. And my last bearded man became, so special to me. I met him at Diversity Gardens, and one afternoon I went there and I noticed a man was picking up litter, putting it in the garbage, arranging chairs in sort of conversational patterns. And I said to him, are you the caretaker here? He said, no, I'm just Joe Dirt. I said, Joe Dirt? He says, yeah, I live on the street. And I said, oh, that's quite remarkable that you're doing this. He says, this is my home during the day. At night I have a secret place that I sleep, but here is where I spend my days. And that short encounter led to 3 hours of exchanging stories back and forth. We laughed, we cried, we laughed, we cried some more. He had a silver tongue. If he had not been a homeless man, I would have brought him home with me, to be with me. He was a man I could fall in love with. One morning as I looked out the window onto Yonge Street near Wellesley, I was watching a woman in a doorway set up her home. And she went about it so methodically. And she was hanging things on, well, I couldn't see the hooks, but she was hanging them up on maybe rough cement or whatever. And she just had this circle around her. Well, I couldn't help myself. I didn't start my workout. I grabbed my camera and ran across the street, so eager to meet her. And I call her Dignified Deborah. She had set up a sacred space. It was so sacred that she had a line drawn that could not be crossed. I listened carefully. I didn't ask much. She just slowly revealed herself. And then I said, Deborah, would you mind if I took a photo? And she said, well, only if I can cover my dirty feet. She said, I was just getting ready to give myself a pedicure. And I said, well, sure, you've got that blanket there, cover up your feet. And so she did. And we embraced before I left. She stepped out of her circle into mine, and we embraced. And as I was leaving the gym an hour or so later, I saw her painting her toenails. When I went back to the gym next day, I was eagerly anticipating another conversation with Deborah. And to my great dismay, I could see that her home had been dismantled. She had likely been evicted by police, and metal bars were put up to keep her from going back. But what she brings to mind about my own journey is two endings to two abusive relationships that I was in. My parents took me into the safety of their home, where I began to rebuild my life so I could be the best grandmother ever. Not only did my mother's spirit walk with me, she walked with me my whole life and guided me to a life of passion and compassion. She herself was able to battle through, punch through so many episodes of extreme mental illness and the ravages of alcoholism. And yet, because my dad was such a dutiful and unrelenting in his care for my mom, she always had a place to live. If not for him, she would have been what we referred to then as a bag lady. We can put Band-Aids on the people, but they're only Band-Aids. We need so much more action. So as a result of learning that, really absorbing it, I know that my next part of my journey is towards activism. I've heard the call, I'm going to answer. And I urge anyone who is listening to me today to respond in a personal manner and also a political manner to the homeless on our streets.